Hello everyone, it's Pobedinsky with you. Do you remember Popeye the Sailor, the hero of comics and cartoons, where the villain constantly kidnaps his girlfriend and he saves her? The plots are very simple, but the main twist is that in crucial moments, Popeye eats a can of spinach and becomes super strong. Agree, it's quite an unusual kind of doping, right? However, there is a logical explanation for this. In 1870, German chemist Erich von Wolff conducted a study to measure the iron content in various foods, and he discovered that spinach has an insane amount of it. About 35 milligrams per 100 grams, which is much more than in other vegetables and fruits. Of course, such a discovery quickly made spinach a superhero among foods. They added it to porridge, pies, salads, and stews, in spices and in fresh, frozen, canned, and dried forms. They even fed it to infants. So, spinach was the perfect choice as a superfood for the cartoon hero. Sounds cool. But it turned out in 1937 that all of this was quite a silly mistake. The publication had a comma placed incorrectly, and in fact it's 100 grams. Spinach contains not 35 but 3.5 milligrams of iron. About the same as in other vegetables. In specialized literature, the mistake was quickly corrected, but in the public's mind, the myth about spinach as the most iron-rich food lived on for quite a while and made this green leafy vegetable very popular. But the most interesting thing is that this story has a second layer. It lived on for quite a while and made this leafy green very popular. But the most interesting thing is that this story has a second layer. In 2010, forensic expert Mike Sutton decided to get to the bottom of the spinach confusion, and it turned out that the whole story is a giant myth. There is no information that von Wolff once analyzed spinach for its iron content. In 1937, the article debunking spinach was never published, and in cartoons and comics about Popeye, there are no references to iron at all. Most likely, the authors chose spinach because of its high vitamin A content. The only thing that's clear is that there was definitely a mistake. But who allowed it, when, why? And is it even connected to the spinach craze or not? Most likely it will remain a mystery. It's not like it was very important for us to know, but it would be nice. Fortunately, not all blunders, miscalculations, and failures are that mysterious. History remembers many examples of small mistakes that led to big consequences. To scientific discoveries, global myths, cultural phenomena, or maybe even disasters or geopolitical consequences. For example, the well-known antibiotic penicillin was discovered by microbiologist Alexander Fleming due to his carelessness. One day, he left a culture of Staphylococcus sitting in the corner of his desk and went on vacation with his family. Although it would be nice to clean up, yes. When he returned a month later, Fleming found that mold had contaminated one of the samples and destroyed the bacteria. After his unintentional research, the scientist isolated the substance penicillin, which became a revolution in medicine and saved millions of lives. Who knows how everything would have turned out if Fleming had been more careful. Or here's another one. In the early 90s, Pfizer was testing a drug for angina that was supposed to increase blood flow to the heart muscle and help lower blood pressure. In the end, they couldn't achieve a significant impact on these parameters, and the experiment was deemed a failure. But turned out that the drug causes an increase in blood flow to a certain other organ, and that's how Viagra was invented. Triplex is a laminated glass that, when struck, doesn't shatter into pieces but simply cracks. It was also discovered due to a blunder. In 1909, French chemist Edgar Benedictus dropped a flask with leftover chemical reagents on the floor, but it didn't shatter into pieces, it just cracked. It turned out that the dried reagents formed a thin layer of cellulose nitrate on the inner wall, which literally glued the glass together. Now a similar principle is used in the production of automotive glass. A thin layer of cellulose nitrate that literally glued the glass together. Now a similar principle is used in the production of automotive glass. In this episode, we're talking about mistakes related to physics that significantly changed our world. Well, maybe not too much, but the discrepancy in scale, mistakes, and consequences is impressive. We'll find out what small detail caused Napoleon's army to suffer defeat. How a mistake 100 times over can save millions of human lives. What happens if you declare the Vorobyevs enemies of the people? And how a wrong translation can change our understanding of the structure of the universe. Let's go. Before we move on to physics, I want to take a moment to point out that small mistakes in anything can lead to big consequences. And this is very noticeable in translation. For example, when HSBC Bank entered the international market, their slogan, "I assume nothing," which means assume nothing, was translated in many countries as do nothing. And it was perceived as if the bank was doing nothing for its clients. Obviously, because of this, the marketing campaign didn't take off, and $10 million went down the drain. There are also some funny examples. KFC. entry into the Chinese market. Their slogan, "Finger licking good," which means lick your fingers, was translated as eat your fingers. And the airline Braniff Airlines had the slogan "Fly in leather," referring to their premium leather seats. Translated it into Spanish as "Vuelo en cuero," and in most Latin American countries it sounded normal. But in Mexico, that expression can mean fly naked, which turned out to be funny, of course, but that was not the effect they were aiming for. Let's get back to the mistakes that changed the world. Let's start with a very small blunder that saved millions of lives. In 1956, American engineer Wilson Greatbatch was working on creating a heart rhythm recorder, devices for recording the sound of the human heart. During his work, the engineer accidentally took the wrong resistor from the box. He needed a 10K resistor, but he inserted a 1M resistor into the circuit, which is 100 times larger. But just so you understand, this is what they look like. There. The value is determined by the colored stripes, and if you don't look closely, it's really easy to mix everything up. When Greatbatch used the wrong resistor, the circuit emitted a pulse every second. The engineer saw it could stimulate the heart and changed his research. 1.8 milliseconds with intervals of 1 second, and it hardly drained the battery at all. At that moment, the engineer realized that this was exactly how to stimulate the heart's function, and he completely changed the direction of his research. For 2 years, Greatbatch refined his invention, and then he quit his main job. He made a batch of 50 devices by hand in his garage. He quit his main job. I made a batch of 50 devices by hand in my garage. After experimenting on animals, he started implanting them in people and eventually received a patent for the world's first implantable pacemaker. It is worth noting that in the 50s, a lot of research was conducted in this direction. Quite successful developments were made in Sweden, for example, but it was Gradbach who managed to create a reliable, well-functioning device. Plus, 10 years later, his company developed lithium iodine batteries, which, after minor modifications, increased the service life of pacemakers from 1 to 10 years and are still used today. So the mistake itself did not lead to a big discovery, but became a powerful trigger for the successful work of a passionate person. Just like an electrical impulse that doesn't pump blood, but makes the heart beat as it should. Currently, pacemakers are implanted in more than 500,000 people each year, 1 person a year. The device is recognized as one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. Wilson Gradbatch's name is inscribed in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Although, it all started with such a tiny little mistake. Well, okay, while we're all talking about stories where educated people make mistakes, and overall, it is not surprising that they can analyze their failures, to draw the right conclusions and turn failure into success. But what about those who don't have the proper knowledge in chemistry, physics, or any other discipline? Over there. Even more interesting, let's move to the mid-19th century at the Rotterdam train station. It's winter, and a train is standing on the tracks, its cars filled with ingots of tin. This entire shipment of metal is headed to Moscow. It arrives at its destination without any incidents, but when the dock workers open the cars, there are no ingots inside. Instead of shiny bars, there's only strange gray dust. Knowing how things are done in our country, one could assume that the ingots didn't just disappear, they simply became part of a more complex logistics scheme. But there's another explanation. The tin didn't disappear from the cars, it just got sick and crumbled. This even has a name, the tin plague. It's an amazing phenomenon. It turns out that tin, which is a light silver, flexible, and malleable metal, can only exist at temperatures above 13 degrees Celsius. Then it's called white or beta tin. It can only exist at temperatures above 13 degrees Celsius. Then it's called white or beta tin. And when cooled, it can transform into another form. Gray or alpha tin. The atoms of the substance rearrange into a different crystalline lattice. It's more porous, with a density that's 20% lower. And because of that, the metal literally crumbles into powder. The transition process can start on its own, at very low temperatures, or maybe just from the contact of gray tin with white. It's precisely because of this phenomenon that it's called a plague. Just a tiny speck of gray tin is enough, and the infection spreads at a crazy speed. There is a known case in which the entire roof of the post office in Rothenburg, covered with layers of pure cast tin, collapsed. And all because of tiny specks of gray tin that were carried by a strong wind from the old town hall nearby. Tin plague is also called museum disease because it often affects exhibits in unheated storage facilities. You can get white tin back by melting gray tin, but you won't be able to restore its original form. And what's interesting is that these are far from isolated cases. So why didn't people decide after the first incident, all right, let's not use tin in the cold? Agreed? plague targets pure metal. Impurities help. Old tin resists cold better. The town hall roof of impure metal stayed intact. So old, not very clean tin tolerates cold better. Actually, that is why the roof of the town hall did not collapse. It was made of less pure metal. And here we are, having figured everything out and sounding so smart, discussing it on the internet. But in the 19th century, they didn't know all the details, and the misunderstanding of the process led to all sorts of consequences. Perhaps the most significant event that influenced the course of history was the defeat of Napoleon's army in the 1812 war. The terrible frosts caused tin buttons to crumble, no victory. This led to the fact that the tin buttons on the uniforms of French soldiers crumbled to dust. The same thing happened with their dishes and personal items, so there was no talk of victory anymore. The French were doomed. That sounds pretty interesting. However, there are no written records of such events. Well, the soldiers would have to spend several months at temperatures below minus 30 degrees. So, it's probably more of a myth than a fact, but it's so vivid and based on real physical processes that I couldn't help but share it. What is certain, though, is the tragedy of the British expedition led by Robert Scott, who aimed to be the first to conquer the South Pole. The team left supplies of food and fuel along the route to use on their way back. And in January 1912, they reached their goal. There they discovered that they had been beaten to it by the Norwegians, literally for 1 month. But worst was yet to come. On the way back, the team found empty canisters in the supplies they had left behind. The fuel spilled out, and part of it boiled the food. And many researchers believe that this happened because of the seams soldered with tin, which crumbled in the cold. The polar explorers didn't take into account the tin pest, and due to the lack of food and heating, the entire team perished by March 1912. Tin is still actively used today, mainly in alloys. For example, an alloy with lead is used for soldering. So don't worry, your circuit won't fall apart in the cold. Moreover, there are attempts to eliminate lead since it's harmful, and to solder with pure tin. But then the circuits start to grow whiskers, or rather, vibrissae. Very long, thin strands sticking out of pure metal. This can lead to short circuits, with known cases on Sputnik and even at nuclear power plants. So that solution isn't an option either. We have to use alloys with antimony, bismuth and nickel even though it's more expensive. But for now, nothing better has been thought of. That's how it is, tin capricious. Although they look like just pieces of metal. Let's move on. The next story is not just about some technical or engineering miscalculations, but also about human greed and dishonesty. 1 second, sorry. So, the guys from Dodo Pizza came by and asked me not to do an integration, but instead brought a story related to the episode. Me to share. You could say it's fresh off the press. Well, by the way, this is also about engineering mistakes, and quite amusing ones at that. So, you could say it's a case with a happy ending. Look here. This is the Walkie-Talkie skyscraper in London. It's called that because it looks like a walkie-talkie, which is what it's called in English. The skyscraper was built by 2014 to the great discontent of the garage. Probably because there's the tower nearby, along with many other historical buildings, it really stands out from the other skyscrapers in the city. So, it caused fires in nearby parked cars. The concave facade focused sunlight, acting like a burning device. Temperatures reached 70-90 degrees C on the street. It turned out that the building's concave facade was focusing sunlight in one spot, and you could say it became a giant burning device. On the street where the light was directed, temperatures were recorded from 70 to 90 degrees Celsius. And in some places it reached 117. I'm sure if those who built the building hadn't skipped their physics lessons on geometric optics, specifically on concave mirrors, none of this would have happened. Reflected rays damaged surfaces. Items melted, matte ignited. A parked Jaguar, plastic parts of a van and tiles on buildings were coming off due to the heat. Personal belongings melted on the windowsills, and once even the rug at the entrance to the hairdressers caught fire. In general, there was a lot of noise about it. A journalist from a local newspaper even fried an egg on a frying pan in the rays coming from the skyscraper. It would be quite funny if you could cook pizza, but you need at least 260 degrees for that. So what happened in the end? They banned parking on the street, and the construction company had to pay compensation to the victims and install sun protection devices on the facade. The most interesting thing is that the original plan for the building included such devices. But at some point they decided to cut the budget and remove them from the project. There you go. Saved money. Another proof that the miser pays twice. Well, that's quite instructive. Thank you, Dodo Pizza, for such a hot story. It's not just pleasant to be with them, but also beneficial. And we move on. The incident with the skyscraper. Overall, it's quite positive. There were no casualties. In the end, everything was fixed, and they learned from their mistakes. Unlike the next story, where everything is the opposite, look. This is a dam. The Vajont Dam, built in 1961 in northern Italy. The photos were taken in our time, and let's agree they look brand new. No cracks, no damage. Nevertheless, it became the cause of a tragedy that claimed several thousand lives. It was precisely due to the negligence of the engineers, the greed of the corporation, and mistakes in the calculations. Even before it was put into operation, the region was known for its constant minor tremors. For some reason, it didn't bother anyone. And during the construction, cracks started to appear on the slopes, and small landslides occurred, which were ignored by the management of the companies. Additional hydraulic studies. In the end, we had to carry it out, but it was just for show, to make sure everything looked okay in the results. Even after a massive landslide of 800,000 cubic meters occurred in the water just 10 minutes after the reservoir was partially filled. They didn't really change anything. They only modeled what seemed to be an extremely unlikely situation. Where as much as 40 million cubic meters slides down in just a minute and a half, they calculated that a wave would rise to a height of 25 meters. So they decided that in case of strong movements, they would drain water from the reservoir and keep a buffer of those 25 meters. Everyone was fine with that again. I think you can already sense what's coming. In October 1963, when the reservoir was almost completely filled, giant cracks appeared on the slopes and trees began to fall. They managed to lower the water level to the calculated buffer of 25 meters, but that turned out to be a huge mistake. In just one moment, in just 45 seconds, 270 million cubic meters of forest earth and rocks came down the slope at speeds of up to 110 km/h, and it raised a wave 250 meters high. Of course it did. It crossed over the dam and with deadly force rushed down the gorge, sweeping everything in its path. For several minutes, this giant water flow, moving at speeds over 80 km/h, completely destroyed. Sang villages. The victims numbered between 2,000 and 3,000 people. The dam itself wasn't damaged, and most of the reservoir ended up being filled with the landslide itself. As a result of the investigation, it was found that during the rushed and cost-cutting surveys on the slope, deep, thin layers of clay measuring 5 to 15 centimeters between the limestone rocks were not identified. Heavy rains and the filling of the reservoir led to a rise in groundwater and reduced the resistance to sliding in those layers. The investigation acknowledged the engineering mistakes, violations of standards and laws, but only the chief engineer received a sentence. Right now, the towel isn't serving its purpose, but it's open to tourists, including as a monument to greed and disregard for the laws, both legal and physical. In the next story, the important big shots also decided to ignore the laws of nature. Just not so obvious, so the tragedy turned out to be significantly larger in scale. It doesn't have a direct relation to physics, but it's so shocking that I can't help but share it. In 1958, the government of Communist China decided to increase the volume of agricultural crops. The population was increasing, but it was becoming harder and harder to feed them. One of the measures was a nationwide campaign to eliminate 4 pests: rats, mosquitoes, flies, and sparrows. The first 3 are more or less clear, but what do sparrows have to do with it? It was believed that they consumed more grain than others and caused the people to starve. They even did the calculations. 10 sparrows can consume about 45 kilograms of grain in a year. And if all of them are eliminated, there's enough grain for 35 million citizens during that same period. With the help of widespread propaganda, they involved all the residents of China in the fight. Mao Zedong himself called on everyone to join the campaign at the party congress. And if things didn't quite work out with mosquitoes, flies, and rats, then the extermination of sparrows took on truly unimaginable proportions. The scale. And here's why. Birds have 2 types of flight: flapping, active, and gliding, passive. The second type is used by larger birds, which can stay in the rising air currents for a long time. Birds with small wings practice flapping flight, which takes a lot of energy from them. So they spend most of their time on the ground and only 10 to 15 minutes flying. For them, that's pretty much the maximum. Then they get tired and land somewhere to rest. This is exactly what they adopted in China. People scared the sparrows with sounds banging on pots, cans, and basins. It was done very coordinated, so the frightened birds couldn't find shelter. To land somewhere, and in the end, they were exhausted from the long flight. They fell to the ground, powerless, where they were finished off. They were shot at, and their nests were destroyed. In total, it's horrifying. In just 3 days in Beijing and Shanghai, they killed 90,000 birds. And by the end of the campaign, this number reached almost 2 billion across the country. Very scary numbers. What happened next? A year later, the harvest really did increase. But then other pests multiplied significantly. Caterpillars and locusts. But for now, they weren't causing that much damage. Like sparrows. And then a year later, a disaster began. There were so many pest insects that the yield sharply dropped. They started to destroy the locusts here, but they're not like sparrows. You can't get rid of them that quickly. As a result, a massive famine began in the country, which claimed the lives of over 20 million people. The benefits of sparrows turned out to be significantly greater than the harm they caused. Because besides grains, they also ate those very harmful insects. The mistake was acknowledged even by Mao Zedong himself, but it was too late. Later on, China had to artificially restore the population of the destroyed birds and purchase them from other countries. For example, USSR and Canada. The remaining sparrows are now being heavily protected, and campaigns are still being held in their defense. Surprisingly, this isn't the first such case. During the plague in London, they decided to exterminate cats, which only made things worse. After all, the disease was carried by mice and rats, which multiplied exponentially. So, I hope that the extermination of sparrows will be the last clear example of how human intervention in nature, without understanding the processes, can impact an entire ecosystem. And our life. Let's move on. Let's not limit ourselves to stories about our planet and move over to our neighbor Mars. Right away the question is, do you believe in life on it? I understand it's not that relevant. In just 10 years, scientists will receive soil samples collected by the Perseverance rover. And no one expects to find traces of life there anymore. But it wasn't always like that. Perhaps throughout the 20th century, there were quite serious doubts about Mars. Perhaps just life, but at least bacteria or some kind of mold or even intelligent beings. And it turns out, there is a well-documented mistake that started the whole saga. A small detail that made even completely lifeless planets strong contenders for the existence of advanced civilizations. This is Giovanni Virginio Schiaparelli, an Italian astronomer who studied the surface of Mars in the late 19th century. In 1877, during his observations, he noticed dark lines on the planet's disk, which he called the Italian word canali, and carefully illustrated in his works. These works greatly intrigued other scientists. There were many translations, and it was in English that the fateful mistake occurred. In Italian, canali means channels of any origin, both natural and artificial. And in English it was translated as canals, which means channels that someone built, exclusively artificial. At that time, the Suez Canal had already been opened. They had started digging the Panama Canal, so canals were the trend of the time. And the news about similar structures on Mars, suggesting that there are Martians smarter than us, quickly spread around the world and stirred the minds of society. Sci-fi writers started churning out novels about mysterious Martians. The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells and The Elite by Alexander Tolstoy, the novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs. The Martian boom lasted all the way into the 70s. Take, for example, Ray Bradbury with his Martian Chronicles and Isaac Asimov's The Martian Way. Scientists were developing hypotheses about what life could be like on another planet. After all, according to Techlet, Mars was quite similar to Earth. The same axial tilt as Earth, atmospheric density, and it was even suggested that there was liquid water. And the American entrepreneur and astronomer, Percival Lowell, obsessed with Mars, built an observatory. He mapped Mars, believing Martians moved water. He observed the planet's surface for a long time and created a detailed map of Mars, marking about 600 channels. He believed that the Martians used them to carry water from the polar ice caps to the equator for irrigation in the dry land. Soils. It sounds crazy now, but back then it sounded quite progressive. But what was it really? Schiaparelli himself never claimed that the lines he discovered were of artificial origin. However, didn't deny it either. Telescopes at the end of the 19th century had low resolution, and many details could blend together. So, most likely, it was just an optical illusion. And the astronomer's desire to make the desired seem real. And since the surface of Mars is best seen during periods of great oppositions, when it is closest to Earth, checking the information about the channels wasn't that easy, as these moments happen once every 15 to 17 years. During the opposition of 1909, the most powerful telescopes failed to detect any channels. And the popularity of the idea in scientific circles began to fade. Well, when, in the 1970s, the artificial satellite Mariner 9 was sent into orbit around Mars, and it transmitted detailed images of the surface. There were no options, after all. However, the myth about Mars lived on among the people. Just like with spinach, it lived on for a very long time, even though it came about because of a tiny mistake. Of course, these aren't the only instances where small mistakes led to disproportionately large consequences. Some of them really managed to change the world for the better, and some was terrible disasters. In any case, it's important to note that you shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes. If you're studying something, whether it's rare butterflies in a reserve or Celtic literature from the 4th century, if you're striving to achieve something, to become a great writer, or win the heart of that special someone, don't be afraid of mistakes, because only you. So, you'll understand where the path you need lies. The main thing is to draw the right conclusions. And then, as I already said, all failures can be converted into success. That's all for now. Like, hit the bell, subscribe, and don't forget about our builders. Soon, new ones will be coming out. By the way, stay tuned for updates, and see you in the next episodes. New ones will be coming out soon. By the way, stay tuned for updates, and see you in the next episodes. And see you in the next episodes. Goodbye.